All right. I think we can probably go ahead and start. So, for those of you who are here or just arriving, hello. My name is Syrixia. I'm currently one of TNP's two deputy ministers of culture. I'm also an RPer in the world of Eris, which is the primary setting of TNP's Forum RP. It's a mostly modern tech, realistic, to a degree, world of really vibrant cultures and complicated politics, I would say. And actually, on that note, there are actually three deputies. I got that number wrong. But now, here's the point. Oftentimes, in RP, we tend to associate ourselves with concepts and ideas we're more familiar with. Because, after all, if we know more about them, then the logical next step is that we will be able to execute them better. So one day in 2016, I was sitting in the cafeteria of my high school, just eating my lunch, having fun, I guess. But I was also reading just like some transcripts from RPs that I had previously done. And I was kind of fed up with the creative direction in which my Eris Nation was going. So I decided I'm going to take that concept that my Eris Nation was adhering to, and I turn it on its head. And today, what my goal is to tell you why I did that, what it taught me, and what it can teach you. And in doing so, my hope is to tell you and get you thinking about the ups and downs of role-playing a nation with a culture that very much does not hail from the West. So, starting off, the experience effect. That's a big component of that part of RP. So, why did I do it? And more importantly, what did I do, period? Well, up until that point, my nation was as generic as they come, really. It was the most serene republic of Syrixia, which I guess is a more eccentric title, but besides that, there wasn't really anything special to it. The entirety of its substance really lay in what it did on the world stage in active national RP, and that simply wasn't really enough for me. I wanted to give my nation a foundation rather than just using it with all its potential as a mere jumping off point for foreign policy. So, put simply, I just wanted to world build my nation and better understand and establish it. One thing I do want to say, though, first and foremost, is that non-Western inspired nations are not inherently more creative than ones with more Western inspired cultures. And entirely original cultures are also not inherently more creative than cultures inspired by real life ones. I've always said that the creativity lies in the handling of the material. Building a culture is like working on ceramics. Regardless of what the clay is, the creativity lies in how it's sculpted. When it comes to RPing non-Western cultures, like I said, consider the experience effect. The best way to learn anything is through experiencing it, and you're going to want to get a basic idea of the culture and then just jump right in. You're going to want to immerse yourself in it and do that before you get too far into the specifics and the intricacies, because once you're more immersed in it, you'll be able to tackle those bits much better. Now, for example, on that day in 2016, I chose to mold my main nation into the Syrixian Empire, which it now is. And I molded it on the Indian culture. Being part Indian myself, I knew a decent bit about the culture, but only what I had learned through osmosis. Another person I know, for example, made a Chinese country because he's learning the language and is learning about the culture through his classes. However, you really don't need to already know a specific culture to pick it. If you're not significantly familiar with most or even all non-Western cultures, that's fine. If anything, it just makes it more fun. As well as mentioned before, an entirely original constructed culture also does count as a non-Western culture because it's not inspired by anything. And when it comes to them, I always like to say the experience effect is a bit trickier because there's nothing to really immerse yourself into. You can't just get settled in. But it's definitely still possible, and once you've gotten the basics over with, you can absolutely immerse yourself. And that really leads me to the 3 steps. So, regardless of whether your nation is inspired or original, there are always three things you need to figure out when it comes to non-Western cultures, because you know you don't really have as much to go on, as much context to go on when you're planning these things. So these three steps are really important to sort of wade through the woods that is world building and RPing these non-Western nations. And those three steps are how your people see themselves, how their history and religion slash morals impact that vision, and how that ties into what they do on the world stage. Now, firstly and most fundamentally, you need to establish how your people see themselves and their society. The European nation state model obviously does not automatically work here. It may work. For example, if your nation was a colony of a Western-inspired nation, like India wound up being, or was heavily exposed to Western-inspired ideas and concepts, like Japan. And even then, the question arises, what came before? And cultural inspiration can actually give a lot of insight into how you answer this question. With China, for example, before Western ideas helped found the Republic of China, the Chinese during the Qin Dynasty, or the Qing Dynasty, saw themselves as the Han people living within the Qing state, which happened to include Zhongguo, or China proper, which the Chinese saw as the heart of their civilization. When it comes to original countries, meanwhile, there's a easy and a hard method. You can either cherry pick ideas from various cultures and tweak them to fit yours, or you can go for the true scratch method and base it entirely, specifically, and uniquely on the early historical developments you set out for your country. Though I should note, for any nation, wholly original or not, if you like the cherry picking method, don't be afraid to cherry pick cultural bits you like. And we'll get back to that later. Secondly, you need to establish how your nation's history and religion slash morals impact how its people see themselves. If you have a basic idea of how the nation works and how its culture works, justify it with a history. Don't be afraid to make changes to the core cultural fundamentals from the previous step as well, based on the history you're planning during this phase either. As well, you need to factor in your nation's religion and its morals. And I will also say, some cultures, though, as it relates to ancient history, it is pretty rare, obviously, but it's not unheard of to have a more secular, atheistic culture. I've world built one myself that existed on part of my landmass, so it is possible. But you're going to, chances are, if you're in the dark, you're not sure what to do, a good idea, especially if your country is entirely original, is to try and make up a native religion based on your vision for your nation's early history, as well as your environment. So, for example, if your nation is mostly tundra, perhaps a god of wind or snow. If your country is more inspired by an existing non-Western culture, though don't let that stop you. There are a myriad of deific entities in Eastern religions, from Indra to Kuan Yin, and more to take inspiration from. And through religion, you can give your culture morals, or vice versa. And these morals can, in turn, impact your religion's mythology and history because the people will, naturally, largely shape their perspectives around them. So, thirdly, once both of these things are mostly settled, and again, you can change anything at any time you want, you should consider how what you've created ties into your nation's action on the world stage. So this is when I return to cherry-picking aspects of culture you may find interesting and want to use. My nation, for example, has a broadly Indian culture, but despite this, it sees itself politically in a more similar way to imperial-era China. There are various ethnicities within the Syrixia Empire, all part of one state, and it's the state that people identify with, not any nationalistic ideal. Indeed, I even adapted the name Syrixia, which had existed before the culture change, to fit that change. Now it's a Mercanti, which is an Aris version of English, corruption of the Hindi, or in Aris Suchari word Samrajya, which simply means the empire. And that is what they call themselves. The people of my nation largely call themselves imperials and their state the empire. That's just what they know. It's ingrained in their culture. And just like the idea of a nation state is ingrained in Western cultures. In foreign correspondence as well, they refer to themselves as such, and other nations too will sometimes, though not always, mostly not always, but will sometimes refer to it as such, especially it's like former colonies say. This in turn leads me to another example of how you can tie these things into everyday RP, the culture's impact on your nation's foreign policy. So going back to the Syrixian Empire, Imperials, or Syrixians, are by and large a more conservative people, culturally. This ethos tends to shape their foreign policy goals, which rely on the notions of stability and harmony. And these notions I drew from Imperial China as well. The empire wants the international order of Eris to be stable and harmonious so that its massive retail market can thrive and grow. Another example would be, going back to China, the Ming Dynasty. Alongside the fleet that alongside the fact that Zheng He's treasure fleets were very expensive, later Ming emperors decided to just close off foreign trade because they didn't think they needed it. The Ming state held Zhongguo, the heart of all civilization, China proper, and it was already filthy rich. They saw themselves as inherently the greatest state in the world, so why bother? Keep in mind as well, though, that a pragmatic foreign policy, and really any form of political ideology when it comes to your nation's government, is fair game, especially in modern tech settings. In past tech settings, since the world is less connected, you may have to rely on more native-based ideas, though by no means is this the case, as exemplified by such things as Greco-Buddhism or the vast lapis lazuli trade across the ancient Near East. But either way, with non-Western cultures and non-Western-based nations, it's almost always quite fun to explore. So, in conclusion, I will say finally, there's the universal role of RP, which is have fun. World building a non-Western culture, and RPing it is really a great way to explore and learn about other cultures, enjoy yourself, and step out of your comfort zone. And ever since that day in 2016, I've made many changes here and there, and really I've loved every minute. And with that being said, that's mostly all I have to say. So I think what we can do now is, I think let's keep the VC muted, obviously, so no one talks over me if I'm answering any questions. But I think in the lecture hall channel, I think we can definitely open it up to questions, and I'll be happy to answer them. By the way, I should say, because he did ask, and Pry isn't really available because he doesn't have a mic. I did permit Heighton to unmute himself just so he can help me sort of process any questions I may make. That's actually a good question, Bob, and thank you both for the compliments. But if I were to say how I would sort of recommend a course change, if you will, from a non-Western culture to a more Western one, I think really, and if we're talking about Eris, obviously, you can do more than one nation. So if you want to keep your more Western nation, but also work on a non-Western one, then you can obviously create a second nation. But I think in general, if you want to do that, then usually the best way I go about it is, first of all, I would approach any RPers who your history impacts and who impact your history to sort of work out how that would work. You want to tie up all loose ends. And then once those loose ends are tied, and don't be afraid to make compromises, because sometimes there will be problems. But I think once those loose ends are mostly tied or are somewhat tied, then I would say just start retconning. Obviously, don't be destructive about it. And like I said, make sure that people are heard before you do. But don't be afraid to, because what you really don't want to do is be sort of stuck in a nation that you don't want. So regarding Ducky's question, let's see. When role-playing culture, how strong is the effect on personalities. Are there any tips for making culture stand out in dialogue and character discussion? I think when it comes to making culture stand out in character discussion, one of the best ways is through sort of slang or idioms, just like things that people say. Like, for example, in the West, when you're shocked, you'll say, oh, goodness, or oh, my God. Do you make a version of that for your culture? Or stuff like that. These sort of spontaneous, it's really the small things. It's the small things that I think make the most difference on that note. And when it comes to how strong is the effect on personalities, well, culture obviously it has a very large impact on really how personalities work, because it helps shape your morals, it helps shape social interaction. So you don't want to be overly reliant on sort of dogmatic cultural maxims, but you want to definitely consider it and how it'll impact your people. But I would obviously say never, go too crazy with it. Now to Heighton's question: have you found it difficult for some collaborative RP when there aren't any other nations with similar cultures? Oh yes, this is a subject that has haunted me for quite a while. No, I'm kidding. But no, on Eris there are no other nations with Indian cultures except for a short stint, which was not fun. I will not get into. But broadly speaking, there have been no other nations with similar cultures. So what I've tried to do is I've tried to sort of explain it to people, help people understand, obviously not in a condescending way. And if you're in the same situation, never be condescending about it. But, teach people how your culture works, because in the world of foreign policy, that will be very helpful for how their nation interacts with yours. And considering that in character, you're going to have a lot of, realistically speaking, you're going to have a lot of, career diplomats that are dealing with each other on the international sphere. They would logically know these things. So in order for them to be RP'd as knowing these things, you need to also know these things. But I think I haven't really found it super difficult. I've generally, got along. The Empire has a vast array of alliances, and I'm very proud of that. Regarding Holdo's question, a bit of a short one, which is short and sweet. How to develop names. I think when it comes to developing names for non-Western cultures, really it's the same idea as developing names for Western cultures. You're going to want to see what culture you're inspiring, what culture you're taking inspiration from, and then base names on that. Possibly make some original names that follow the same theme. And kind of the same thing applies for more original, like purely original nations. You're going to want to base it off the language, and because a lot of purely original nations will consequently have purely original languages, because if they don't, then they're not fully original. Or perhaps a mostly original nation will have a less original language. But either way, I would definitely say language is the best way to develop names from, because names ultimately mean something. For example, the English last name Smith, it is an occupational name that means just that, Smith, and it first arose because of blacksmiths. So let's see what else we got. Another one from Ducky. How good is ancient Mesopotamian culture as a base in a modern tech RP setting? I assume that's what you said, MT. Regarding ancient Mesopotamian culture, I think obviously it could work. You would need to take into account the setting, but I think as it relates to the language and the base of it, I mean, obviously, ancient Mesopotamia had many gods. So if you don't want your nation to be more pagan, then that's definitely something to consider. But there is actually a wealth of resources for finding Mesopotamian words online, and I actually found one such dictionary, and it's helped me world build that ancient proto-atheist culture that I mentioned earlier, which has since gone extinct, but during the time in which they existed in my nation's history, they did quite a lot, and they had a Mesopotamian culture. So there is a wealth of resources, and I think it's entirely possible. Just sort of be cognizant of the tech setting. One from Farhan. He says, how would you suggest role-playing characters who feel trapped or oppressed by the social conventions of a national culture? For example, exploring the roles of men and women in a traditional honor-based culture, or religious characters in more secular liberal cultures. I think that really comes down to their personality, in my opinion, because some people would probably just sort of deal with it, and others would, speak out more against it. So I think it really depends on the personality of the character. But if that, like you said, characters who feel trapped or oppressed, so if they choose to speak out about that, then a good way of sort of protesting is adopting contrarian sort of apparel or traits or ways of stating things or thinking. And that would sort of, in my view, I think if a protester inherently and purposefully goes blatantly against the social convention, then people will say, obviously, the masses will say, oh wow, that's horrible, you're doing this abhorrent thing, and they're saying that because they're going against the social convention. But some people may also say, wow, you're standing up to the social convention, your case is really interesting, you're really brave, and then that will pique interest. So I think sort of incorporating those contrarian tropes into how they speak out is definitely a good tool. Let's see what else we got.
We have a question about climate.
All right, let me scroll down real quick. There it is from Ducky. He said, another question. When developing purely imaginary culture, how does climate factor into the culture? Like I said, if you have if your nation is, for example, a tundra, then you might include more ice-based gods or whatever. Climate actually, I would say, impacts culture to a significant degree if we're talking about more ancient cultures, because if we're talking about like more modern cultures, like pop culture, for example, it may not as much, obviously, because the modern world has technology to sort of stabilize climates of that to a degree. For example, like air conditioning, and obviously, if your RP setting is dealing with, say, climate change, then that's a thing to consider. But for example, Eris, there's no major sort of climate change that's happening there. So it's entirely up to what the setting is. But how climate factors into culture, that really, like I said, that depends on what the climate is, because that will influence how the culture evolves because of how it deals with things. So humans, they want to, I'm trying to figure out how to put this. Humans' goal, especially early humans, although psychologists will often say really all humans, regardless of when it's in what time in history it is, want to survive. That is the ultimate goal. They want to survive. And definitely in early history, that was or is a major goal. So climate so the culture, especially more ancient cultures, as I said, will often be more inspired by how humans dealt with that climate and what things that led to. So, for example, say your nation likes fur coats or something. Perhaps that's because in ancient times they needed fur coats to keep out the cold. So just stuff like that. It's really about how humanity deals with these stimuli, these climate-related stimuli that leads to climates factoring into culture. So from Gaber, he says, what role does geography play in RP? I would argue it plays the exact same role as it does in real life. Geopolitics, especially in the field of international relations, what a country wants, what a country needs, what a country has at its disposal, all that is determined by its geography. And lots of countries have geographic pluses and geographic challenges. For example, the YouTube channel Stratfor, they have published a bunch of videos on the geographic challenges that a lot of countries face. So that's definitely a really good resource, in my view, to understand the geographic implications on a country's politics and what they need And so I would say that's definitely a big role that geography plays in RP, because as you're on the world stage, you're going to want to, realistically speaking, consider that. You're going to want to consider what geopolitics demands and what your country needs based on that. And Farhan is actually right. The mountainous terrain in Iran, it contributed to governments tending towards greater authoritarianism to hold together disparate populations, because Iran there's a lot of mountains and a lot of valleys. It's not the flattest of places. So there are actually still a lot of various ethnic groups in Iran, and Persian empires have always sought to, well, except for the earlier ones like the Achaemenids, always sought to sort of incorporate those cultures and really unite them. And often that was done by authoritarianism. You can say the same for, say, the Russian Empire. So one thing that Ducky said, let me just read this real quick. He said, a question on culture and etiquette. When, again, working with an imaginary culture, how should one go to about developing the etiquette phrases and norms? Well, you're going to want to consider, like I mentioned, you're going to want to consider the history. What historical occurrences would have impacted, rather, how the people see themselves in the world and how they interact socially. Like, for example, I mentioned the popular phrase in the West, "Oh my God," is exclaimed when you are shocked or something. And that arose from the spread of Christianity into the West, obviously, because it references the Abrahamic God. So you're going to want to look at history, first and foremost, when you're trying to develop etiquette, phrases, norms, all those sorts of things. But often as well, you can also, if your nation is heavily impacted by another, whether it's Western or not, you can also look to other nations for inspiration. For example, loanwords in various languages. I often think of, and this is a country that's not in the West, so it's a good example, but I often think of the Ottoman Turkish language, which was a dialect of the Turkish language that was used by the elites during the Ottoman period. And it had many loanwords from Arabic, because the Ottomans considered themselves the caliphs of Islam. So they wanted to sort of promote an image that, the high society was sort of well in tune with that image, that the Ottomans were the ultimate authority in the Middle East. So let's see, what else we got? For one from Holdo, he says, how do you develop pop culture clothing? Well, I think this kind of ties into how do you develop a pop culture. And obviously I think that's less to do with more base culture and more to do with the things that influence pop culture, such as media or occurrences in the news or memes. Yes, I said it. They are actually a pretty important part of pop culture. Just ask an increasingly large amount of social scientists these days. But a lot of tropes in pop culture are often developed from these sorts of things. So again, what you really want to do is look at, what's going on with your nation, perhaps world build famous shows, or, news topics of that sort. And those things in turn can be drawn from history. They can be historical media, or they can be, like sitcoms or whatever. But really, pop culture it is obviously to a degree, but it's not 100% reliant on more base culture. All right. Do we, Heighten, are there any questions I missed?
We have one from Gaber.
Is it, oh yeah, I see. What do you do when your nation tech is future tech? More importantly, how does tech influence culture? So I assume that depends on the situation. If your nation is future tech, but it's not like a giant space nation, then I think the same principles apply for base culture, but you just also need to factor in the tech level. Um, when it comes to giant space nations, though, there is and I do have some experience with this because there is a setting in the Forum RP known as Aeneas, which is it's named after the Aeneas sector of a fictional galaxy, quasi-fictional, that has a lot of space nations. So I think I can definitely say that in regards to giant space nations, it's important to remember, first and foremost, it's important to remember or consider rather, are there any dominant cultures in this space nation? And if so, what are they? Because if there are dominant cultures, and, speaking in more Darwinian terms, logically, there will tend to be, based on the balance of power, and also what cultures are more able to spread. But also, yeah, the balance of power as it relates to various cultures in that space nation. But once you have this dominant culture, then oftentimes that will be the one that spreads. And in regards to, more importantly, you mentioned how does tech influence culture? I feel like tech has a major influence on pop culture because it enables the spread of pop culture components more easily. But in regards to how tech influences base culture, perhaps it could be how the culture is inclined, or rather how the mainstream is inclined to treat that technology, or how the mainstream is inclined to sort of market that technology, how companies are how companies are inclined to market that technology to the masses, and the tropes they will use in their advertisements to market that technology. So, one from Fiji, he says, how do you build your nation with the nuance and complexity that signals authenticity and creativity, and how do you avoid stereotypical representations of the culture that misrepresent it? I think this is actually a really good question, and I've had to deal with this a lot in the sort of more early days of the culture change, in like 2016, early 2017. And like I said, this goes back to the experience effect and immersion, because what you want to do is immerse yourself in that culture. And then as you do, and as you sort of incorporate more tropes and or make up more tropes, then it starts to become more your own. If I look back on where the Syrixian Empire was in 2016, after I made the culture change, after I revamped it first, it was still somewhat drab. It was a constitutional monarchy. It had a prime minister and stuff like that. It was Indian in culture, and it had a monarch, but like there wasn't really much else to it. And then as I sort of made up more about the culture, as I learned more, as I immersed myself more, as I got into it more, I began to incorporate more tropes from other cultures. I began to make up my own tropes and just world build it more. What you want to do is world build your nation, understand it, understand its history, and get to know it more, because that will help you, understand your nation more, but it'll also help you, like I said, in the foreign sphere. You don't want to do what I was doing with my nation before my big culture change. You don't want to have your nation just be a springboard onto the foreign stage without really elaborating much on it, especially considering, and this goes back to what Gant was saying yesterday about out of character and in character, that the more drab your nation is, often, at least in my experience, I tended to address things in a more personal manner because there was less content there that I could understand and then address things in a manner befitting a fully formed or mostly fully formed nation. So I tended to address things more personally. because there was just less there. So that's what I had to go on. And also, it has to be considered that ARSRP back in the day was not nearly as sophisticated as it is now. But I think that personal component was definitely a very big part of it. So regarding what Farhan said, he says, what do you have to say about national epics, literature, poetry, architecture, art, etc.? Do you feel these are important in giving a nation a degree of verisimilitude? I'm going to have to look up what that word means real quick. The appearance of being true or real. I think it does. I think these. Thanks, Fiji. But I think it does. I think these sorts of things. These are the things that are kept by museums, and they're kept by museums because they're important ways of remembering the past, remembering origins and history, and that also has an impact on culture. So if you world build national epics, literature, poetry, architecture, art, etc., these things will actually have an impact on your culture because it'll help define your culture, especially if you understand what goes into those sorts of things and the content. You don't want to just say oh, this is the epic of something something and it's about this. You want to give more context, maybe even write some lines or interpret a work of art or architecture, or say where that architecture came from, or who wrote the poetry and why, or who wrote the book and why, and so on. So obviously, elaborate about it and think about how that impacts your nation and how your nation's culture impacted it and how it impacts your nation's culture. But I think to like TLDR answer, I think it definitely has a big sense of importance in really fleshing out your nation and making it more real. I know a lot of people who have built these things, and their nation just seem more demonstrably more real. You can talk about them, and you can learn about them as if they were another nation you learn in your history class. And if you get to that point, it's really fun, and it makes nation states so much more engaging than the basic stuff. And yes, I am absolutely thinking about Goyanis right now.
Well, Holdo had a very good question here. How do you describe your culture? Describe
it
your nation.
seems like he's saying, how do you describe culture? Because obviously, yeah, like you said, it's not really it's by no means easy to just sit down and write about a culture. And I'm hoping that the steps that I gave will help if that culture is non-Western, but I think they also help if that culture is Western. I chose to focus on non-Western cultures, not just because I RP one, but because since we're all, like I said, since we're all more exposed to Western cultures, we tend to have a better idea of what goes into those cultures and what you can pull from. But in terms of how exactly I would describe culture, I feel like I would describe it as sort of, and this is by no means sort of like an orthodox definition. Obviously, dictionaries and social scientists can describe it way better than I can. But I would say, off the top of my head, that a culture is really the social components within a society or within a group of people that help determine, not determine, but help determine how people may act or how people may evaluate situations. I think that's a really broad way of saying. I think that's a really broad but well-encompassing way of saying it. Right, do we have any other questions?
Anyone?
I should also say, if you can't think of a question now, don't be afraid to talk to me later, or really any time during the symposium or any time at all. Obviously, I've been around here. I think as of next month, I've been around nation states for going on 5 years, so I've seen a fair amount, and I'm sure Pry's laughing right now because he's been around for 11 years, but uh, but no, I've seen a fair amount, and obviously, I've world built a fair amount of tropes for my culture. So I'm always open to giving advice. I love to sort of help people world build their cultures. I will say, I'm not really good at economics, but when it comes to history and culture, I'm definitely passionate about that, and I love those sorts of things. And that's also why I chose this topic for my lecture. Heighten, you have a question. I think I'll answer your question, then I'll go back to Holdo's one because I mentioned you first.
All right. So, how does religion factor in, especially considering you have a non-Abrahamic religion in Syrixia?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mentioned this in the lecture as well. Religion helps, and I'll pull this. Let's see here. Yeah, you need to establish how your nation's morals impact how your people see themselves, and you need to really think about that because religion is hugely an impact on culture. Now, as I said, it's not entirely impossible for cultures to be ancient, more storied cultures to be more secular. Like I said, I'm world building one myself in my ancient history. But broadly speaking, a religion is a great way to really understand how your culture will interact with itself, how your culture will conduct itself, because morals are a really big factor in discourse within a culture. For example, here's a moral: murder is bad. That's a moral. It is considered bad to kill your fellow man. So as a result, you are all probably thinking right now, yeah, of course it's abhorrent to kill your fellow man. But in the Agori culture in India, for example, comes to mind, they have a habit of really glorifying death, not necessarily maliciously, committing murder, but definitely glorifying death. They have a huge emphasis on skulls and those sorts of things. But that's just those are their morals, and a lot of people, especially in more pre-modern times, consider that intensely peculiar because the maxim "murder is bad" is one of the most widespread values that is present in culture, and for good reason, because when a person is killed, it makes the amount of humans on the planet less, and it also tears families apart and stuff like that. So it's obviously very bad, to commit murder. So as a result, murder is seen as a bad thing. But my point in mentioning that is, like I said, morals play a very big part in how cultures form. And religion is a very big instrument in deciding or world building morals in a culture. So Holdo said, excuse me, Holdo said, how much should cultures vary from city to city? This, I think, depends on the tech level. If your nation has a lower tech level, and if your nation has it's less well connected, communications are harder, then it's going to be harder to have a uniform culture from city to city. Whereas, like you said, let's say in a modern tech environment, it is, I would say, obviously demonstrably easier to have the same culture from city to city. Now, of course, you may have city-based sort of pop culture, like for example, sports rivalries, and that can also factor into areas too. For example, the Buckeyes and Wolverines come to mind, between Michigan and Ohio. But really, I think in the modern day, city to city culture variation is less so since the world is becoming more connected. Though obviously, I will say if there is an area in your country that notably has a different culture from most of the other areas in the country, or even if your country does not have a unified culture, then cities in various areas of different cultures will have those cultures, obviously. And no problem, Ron. Thanks for attending, and obviously thanks to everyone for attending. Really, but on that note, do we have any more questions?
All right.
I actually have a question.
Sure.
Actually, hang on just 1 second. I'm sorry, I'm pulling up to a drive.
No, that's all right. We got two people typing, so. And yeah, Height does have a point that you can world build that sort of stuff in your nations. Like Heighton says, oh yeah, I use the HCFC versus Trier FC rivalry for that reason, to emphasize the traditional rivalry between the north and south of my country. That's what Heighton said. That's a great example. So Ducky.
Okay.
Yeah, you can go first, Bri.
Okay, so I guess my question, in terms of broad cultural development and world building, what would you say distinguishes someone who is working with a Western nation versus a non-Western based culture? What would you say is the main distinction there?
I think really that depends on the tropes involved. Obviously, you can't really say that some nations are quote unquote more Western than others because there are various cultures within the Western sort of sphere. And the definition of what makes up the West is itself fluid and hotly debated by scholars. So I feel like very broadly speaking, I would probably say nations that have influence from like cultures cultures or legal culture or those sorts of things that have influence from, say, Greco-Roman tropes, or nations that are in Europe or the U.S. or those sorts of things. Like places that are traditionally considered in quote unquote the West. And really, when it comes to more non-Western cultures, like I said, you can take inspiration from. If you're not going for a purely original culture, you're taking inspiration from a non-Western culture. That depends on what you're looking at, because, like I said, you can have a non-Western culture that you can have a base non-Western culture that takes in Western aspects, such as Indian and Japanese culture. And of course, non-Western cultures aren't just from the East. There's also Africa to consider, and in fact, my original idea for this lecture was that I would sort of talk about my experiences with an Indian, Asian sort of culture, and then Majak was my original co-writer before he stepped out because something came up. He was going to talk about African culture because he has an African nation in Eris. So really, it doesn't have to be just from Asia, although that's one of the most popular sort of places to go if you don't want a Western-based nation. But there's cultures from all over the world that aren't based in Western tropes, or tropes that are sometimes considered quote-unquote Western. You have Native American culture, or Australian Aboriginal culture, or, even in the West, you could argue that the Basque culture and the Basque language aren't technically Western because they're not related to Indo-European languages. Although you could also argue that they are because they've incorporated several cultural aspects from their surrounding areas in Spain and France. And so it's really a complicated issue to consider, but I think generally speaking, those are the things to consider.
Thank you for your answer.
No problem. Regarding what Ducky said, he said, so I'm working on a horror-based nation. Are there any tips for culture in a very post-apocalyptic setting? So I think that depends on what the setting is fundamentally. If that setting is if the setting is a post-apocalyptic Earth, then perhaps you want to consider what the culture was in the area before the apocalypse, and then sort of add in more Mad Maxy variables, like more post-apocalyptic survival variables, whether there's like the remnants of technology available, whether we're going back to sticks and stones. Excuse me. But in terms of that, you want to consider what was there before, if it's possible that could have seeped in. For example, I remember the classic anime Fist of the North Star that was set in a post-apocalyptic Japan, and one of the big components of that show was a martial art from Sumi Pride. It's a classic, but one of the big components of that show was a martial art that is from China, just across the sea. So martial arts is it's a big component of that show, and it is definitely a sizable component of traditional culture in that area. So it was included in the show. You might see martial arts in, say, I don't know, Fallout, for example. If you're hitting somebody without anything in your hand, but or say Mad Max, but you have to consider what was there before, because if there's something notable that was there before that you can draw inspiration from for a post-apocalyptic culture, then that's always really interesting. I was once on a setting in Forum RP called Acheron, which was a post-apocalyptic Earth. My nation was the New Roman Empire, and it was in Italy. And I based a lot of the culture on a combination of post-apocalyptic tropes and ancient Roman laws and culture. So really it just depends on what you can draw inspiration from and how that interacts with, generic post-apocalyptic tropes. Do we have any other questions? Like I said, if there are no more questions, or if you think of a question after, then obviously, feel free to ping me in the general chat, or feel free to send me a DM if it's more personal, or something you just want to, keep more on the down low. But I'm always, open to helping anyone with history, culture, world building, that sort of thing, because it is definitely very interesting. And Ducky, you said you have a question on food. What is that? General trends relating food to type of culture. I would say that, yeah, I think there are. Do you mean like how culture influences food, or how food influences culture? Because obviously they can go both ways. Yeah, either. So I definitely think it could go both ways. It depends on, say, for example, the culture might influence what kind of things that you use to prepare meals. Say, for example, in the West, there are certain types of, or actually, no, a good example would be, I think, kosher, because there are foods that are considered sort of non-kosher that obviously observant Jews shouldn't eat. So really, that depends. So really, but like culture can in ways like that, whether as sort of whether like kosher, like in a religious sense, or in just a base cultural sense, can impact how meals are prepared and what is prepared in those meals. In the same way, food can impact culture. For example, a big stereotype about Americans is that we love burgers. We love burgers because, broadly speaking, we do. We consume a fair lot of them. They're a big staple in restaurants, especially fast food restaurants. They're easy to make, and we, broadly speaking, we like them. So food. So like I bring that example up because food can impact culture as well. And certain foods can be associated with certain cultures because certain cultures will prepare certain foods, often based on the resources that they have available or just based on sort of process of elimination. So really, like you said, like I said, it can go both ways. But I think it's definitely interesting world building foods in association with culture, especially if that culture is original. Because if it's original, then what foods your culture eats is entirely up to you. I mean, really, if it's your nation, so what cultures or what food your culture eats is entirely up to you. But if your culture is more inspired, obviously, you're going to want to go for foods that fit those cultures' tropes. Generally speaking, you're under no obligation to, but like for example, I've generally gone with Indian foods or foods relating to the nations that my country colonized during history in regards to what foods my country eats. But like I was saying, if your country is more original, then you're under no such logical compunction to even consider that. You can just go nuts. And that's one of the benefits of having purely original cultures is in many of these categories, there's nothing pressuring you based on the inspiration to take tropes from certain areas. And of course, that doesn't mean that there's a lot of pressure in inspired cultures, but logically speaking, if you're inspired by something, you're going to want to consider those things. But yeah, no, if the culture is more original, then you could just go nuts. Not sure. I'm not sure how you went to a Fallout conclusion. My avatar is actually, and it's not really sort of pertaining to the lecture. So I'll obviously I can explain it, say in the general chat, but it's Fry from Futurama. Yeah, no. What Fiji said, that's a really good way of putting it. Is especially the availability of resources, and indeed, that's how a lot of cultural variation in meal preparation and what meals are available comes about from is availability of resources. For example, there are a lot of mangoes in India, so as a result, mangoes are a bigger staple in India. It's about what is readily available and what is more readily available than others. And then also, religion. What foods can you eat? What foods can't you eat? I mentioned kosher. Spread of disease. What foods are more susceptible to diseases? What foods are sort of taken out of the equation either by disease or they just stop. They kind of like those foods, those like fruits or vegetables or animals who contribute meat go extinct. And yeah, if stuff doesn't grow or also if your economy or if your culture is more seafaring, then seafood will make more sense. But like I said, you're also under no obligation to have seafood make no sense. For example, the Syrixian Empire, which is my main nation, Valand, which is hosting the debate, and the Ball being my second nation, Syrixia is a very historically seafaring nation. But I haven't really world built a lot in terms of seafood that nation eats. Most of the food that I've world built is based on more Indian foods, and some of that is seafood, but a lot of it isn't. So you're under no obligation to sort of world build certain foods based on your environment unless unless logic demands that you do so. But if you have wiggle room, then definitely go for it and do what works for you. And I think that's a general rule for all of world building in general. And I think I might be wrong, but I think one of the upcoming lectures is on world building. So that may be touched on, but if not, I think that's the general rule. That's the general rule is just go wild and see what you can do what works best for you, and have fun with it. That's really one of the biggest things that you can really do in RP and in world building. And on that note, this is Ducky's last question. And I think this will also be the last question that I answer because it's been about an hour since the lecture started. So, and like I said, if you have any more questions, then feel free to talk to me in the general or send me a DM or whatever. But this last question, is there something about modern technology that suppresses high brutality cultural instincts? For example, blood sports, violent executions, etc. have fallen out of fashion in the modern world. Is this a Western influence or something to do with technology and standard of living? I feel like it has to do more. This is just my opinion because I think this can be debated, and to some extent, I think it's controversial. But because like for example, the debate over the death penalty. But I think excuse me, like Berenice just said. I agree with that. I think it is a matter of cultural development more than technological development. More people, now than ever really, are critical of the death penalty, for example. So as a result, it's just like a lot of societies are sort of weaning off the death penalty. And then you have places like, say for example, in the US, there are states that outlaw capital punishment, and there are states that do not outlaw capital punishment. And obviously this isn't completely the case, but to a certain extent, culture variation between those states can really help determine the broad outlook of those states' populations and governments in relation to their perspectives on those types of issues. And like, for example, you mentioned blood sports. In ancient Rome, blood sports were extremely popular at first. You had the gladiators and stuff like that. And then Christianity came in, and gladiatorial combat eventually became outlawed based on conclusions drawn from Christian morals, which became very widespread. So yeah, I think it's definitely more of a cultural development than a technological development, because technology, what it does in these situations is it helps facilitate these things. For, let's say, blood sports, for example, technology will help you get better weapons. Executions, for example, new ways of execution are invented, such as, for example, the guillotine that was invented. The national razor was invented around the time of the French Revolution by the scientist Guillotine, whose first name I forget, who it was named after. And it was considered, at least by the standards of the time, as a more quote-unquote humane form of execution. Although, of course, now we have even more quote-unquote humane forms of execution. So really, technology can help facilitate these sorts of things, but the actual changes that are made come more from culture, at least in my opinion. And on that note, I think that is where we're going to wrap it up. Like I said before, if you have any other questions, then feel free to get in contact with me. But that is about it. So obviously, a big thanks to. Oh yeah, that was it. Hi, thanks. That was his name, and that was a obviously thanks to everyone who helped me with drafting and revising my lecture, and also to TNP, Greater DNStat, and all the regions participating in the symposium for helping host this event and helping make not just my lecture, but all the lectures possible. And I would obviously say, as Price said, thanks most importantly to everyone who joined. And I'm definitely looking forward to answering any questions that may remain, and also looking forward to being sort of watching, trying to figure out how to put it, but watching the lectures that are to come. And I'm very excited for all of those. So that being said, I think we'll end it there. So if you want, you can go ahead and unmute yourselves.